distinguished talk in the series of Global Dialogue on Dalit Studies in South Asia. Today, it's my pleasure, my singular pleasure, to introduce Dr. Rajesh Sampath. Dr. Rajesh Sampath is our speaker for today. And uh, before I talk to you about Professor Sampath, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this initiative. Uh, Global Dialogue on Dalit Studies in South Asia is a result of tri-nation multi-individual effort, of which one of the leading organizations is, of course, a Dignity Initiative led by our dear friend Roop Sanatji from Nepal, Kathmandu, and we also have one of my organizations, which is based in Simla, Himachal Pradesh, Center for Development Studies, Simla, which is a part of this global effort. And the third individual associated with us is Professor Steve Folmar, who unfortunately cannot be with us today because he had a prior engagement. Usually he leads this talk. So we conceptualized a journal on Dalit studies in 2020, thinking that that the issues related to marginality and caste and social groups or caste-like formations existed elsewhere, and that good practices, global good practices, needed to be brought together at a common platform so that our efforts could be strengthened in not just theoretical understanding, but their application-based practices. So, to strengthen our journal on Dalit studies, we also started this global dialogue on Dalits in South Asia, and it's been a fantastic journey so far. We've had brilliant speakers and academicians and policymakers from across the world who have singularly held or championed the cause of social justice, marginality, and worked and given their whole life on issues of social exclusion and social justice. So, so we've had a fantastic around 3 or 4 year journey from now, and this is our 20th talk, which is going to be given by Dr. Rakesh Sampath. And Dr. Rakesh Sampath is associate professor at the Department of Philosophy of Justice, Rights and Social Change, and he is also the lead program on social exclusion at the Heller School for Global Development and Sustainability at the Brandeis University in United States. The Brandeis University in the United States is incidentally one of the universities globally which has accepted that caste is a form of discrimination and has built it into its own policy of non-discriminatory practices. And it was only after Kashma Sawant and Kashma Sawant's efforts in Seattle and the University of Brandeis's efforts that caste recognized some kind of a public space in the United States of America and globally thereupon. So wonderful work, Dr. Sampath. Thank you so much for that. And Dr. Sampath is a PhD from University of California, and it's like fantastic to know that that you worked for your PhD under Professor Derrida, whom we all study and try to understand. And also, Dr. Sampath then went on to do his postdoctorate from University of California, Berkeley. He has also been a Dart Fellow at the Bremen University in Germany, and he has a fantastic array of interests from critical theory to social justice to issues of social exclusion, and it just goes on and on. And he has authored over 77 peer-reviewed articles. He is also written extensively in books as book chapters, over 18 to 20 book chapters. He has published 2 books, and one of his books is in press, and which will be published by Brill in this year or beginning of next year. So we are very happy to welcome you, Dr. Sampath, today, and we are also equally happy to see that that a lot of people have joined our initiative today, and we would like to listen to your views on this really important topic. Uh, Professor Sampath, you have around 40 to 45 minutes for your talk, and your talk is to be followed by a chat box moderated question and answer session. Uh, we really don't put a timeline on the question and answer session. It just goes on till the time our guest is willing to answer the questions of the participants. So welcome, and please, we would now like to hear your views.
Well, thank you, Prashant, and Professor Prashant Negi, and Dr. Drona, and Roop, my old friends from Nepal. It's such a wonderful honor to be with you. You do me too much honor because I wouldn't see myself as the distinguished lecturer. You're the distinguished group, and we'll have a distinguished group discussion. And I say that because my inspiration to working on social exclusion, social justice, given the legacy of Ambedkar and the critique of caste and all the profound social movements against caste throughout South Asia, not just within India, has inspired me over the last 10 years to do the work. So I put the honor on you, the constituencies and groups and individuals that have fought this battle for time immemorial. And it's really just an honor to be with you. Today, what I'd like to do is I'm not going to focus on a specific country context, but what I have in mind is my recent travel to Nepal. This was just 2 months ago, where I met Roop and many other different groups. Nice to see some old friends and names I can see from the list, and also to see my own students here, and as well as colleagues I've met just more recently. All of us engaged in social change and how we think about democracy. So what I'd like to do is keep Nepal in mind, given the profound changes that you're going through now, with the renewed emergence of this democratic potential and epochal transformation. But of course, my own background is of Indian descent, so I have some familiarity with the Indian context. We'll draw from that history and look at the current context in India as well. I hope this is inclusive of other South Asian countries and experiences because I do see representation from other contexts, and it would be great to have this kind of, as you said, global comparative dialogue. So let me share my PowerPoint, and we can get started. So the title of my talk is Insights from Ambedkarite Buddhist Social Philosophy for Inclusive, Pluralistic, Secular, and Diverse Democracies. And I have to say that I just returned from a trip to Vancouver, where Jai Birdie and the Chetna Association organized a symposium to think about precisely these issues. What can we take from the Buddhistic roots inside the later Ambedkar, his last works on the Buddha and the Karl Marx, all published posthumous. The manuscripts were discovered after his death. The Buddha and the Dharma was published posthumously. How do we come to grips with the Great Conversion at the end of his life and the conversion of the masses? And then what does that mean for his own views regarding the very constitution that he chaired, the genius that he was to be chosen as the chair of the drafting commission? He had so much insight, even at the time during decolonization, to see what could be the limitations of his own work, not just his, but the decolonial emergence of India and the democratic constitution, one of the most, some people consider, one of the most robust, comprehensive constitutions that were drafted in the time, but its limitations and what we need to think about now. And I think it's very important, given what's happening in Nepal, what's happening in many, think of the Gen Z revolutions in many different parts of the world regarding the possibility of an authentic democratic system. So we will look at that, the legacy of Ambedkar, insights from an Ambedkarite Buddhist social philosophy for inclusive, pluralistic, secular, and diverse democracies. Let me see if I can bring this. So the outline, what we want to do is, first of all, define what we mean by that long phrase. Many people promise democracies. Many people have older established democracies, let's say certain Western countries, the US, UK, France. Many had to emerge in the 20th century after decolonization throughout the global south and the east. But I'm struck by the singularity of Nepal, which I want to spend some time with, because the only non-colonial South Asian context with a history too profound and too complex for me to describe. I'm going to beg and ask from you, those that have experience, to teach us. But the scholars that couldn't be here, for example, Professor Steve Fulmer, decades of life and experience in the Nepali context. I can talk about what I normally discuss or teach, the Western origins of modern social contract theory. So some of the big thinkers there. One major figure in the 20th century for theories of justice, John Rawls, 1971, as a response to what traditional frameworks have been and still are for Western democracies. But then we'll pivot dramatically to Ambedkar. And this is kind of a strange juxtaposition because I'll introduce these Western frameworks, but then quickly I want to move to Ambedkar, not from the 1940s and 50s, but what it means to today, given all the burning issues. And the text I want to focus on is his very lengthy Buddha and his Dhamma. Okay. So, origins of modern social contract theory for democracy. This will be very fast. I apologize if it's maybe too fast, but my objective is not to educate or teach all of us about these massive frameworks, but just to take the main points, why they're salient today. In Hobbes's Leviathan, 1649, he assumes that by nature, all of us as human beings, one species, obviously different groups, languages, cultures, but as Dr. Drona told us, no genetic basis at all whatsoever in evolution with regard to caste. And one could argue for race too, despite the outward appearances of differences. But let's say all of us as a human species, one species, inside this state of nature. If you want to believe this, we're primordially driven by survival and instinct, which looks like an evolutionary principle. This is not good. um, because if you put us back into this state of nature, one could argue that we still are. Look what's happening around the world, all the conflicts and violence and oppression and domination. We have to agree somehow to transcend this structure and imagine what consent to being governed looks like. And when this emerges, a constitutional framework, perhaps a democracy of some kind emerges, but the sole responsibility of that new structure is a duty to protect us, not to oppress us or exclude us by divisions and classes and castes. And I'll get into that. So think about that. That's quite amazing for that time period to put the burden back on government, not the divine right of the king to do whatever they want and control society, but to shift the question of duty, responsibility, obligation back to us individuals and people. And then Locke comes later. And the English, as you know, were the first to undergo the democratic transformation, not through some massive violent revolution like the French Revolution, or a decolonizing event like the American Revolution from the British Empire, but a more complicated transformation. But needless to say, these two pillars, these two thinkers were foundational because they brought forth the ideas. Locke assumes rights to life, liberty, and property. Key issue here. So there is no Marx and critiques of capitalism until almost 200 years later. So property, separation of powers, you know that, legislative, judicial, executive. But the main point is refusing any kind of divine right of kings. And that's the long history of all human civilizations from antiquity up until their time. And then how do we imagine state power? Not state violence, which exists, but state power to punish those that violate those natural rights. So there is some obligation for states to exercise power, but we have to always think about the limitation. Many today think this is the forerunner of libertarianism, and there are debates about that. We can leave that aside. And then maybe one of the most intriguing figures, not long, but decades before the French Revolution, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract, his work. And he's intriguing because, yes, the modern instinct for democracies is to promote individual freedom. Absolutely. But he was smart enough to understand when we go down that path, we still have the legacy of different social bonds over time that bind us. And when we get to Ambedkar, we're going to see the importance of social cohesion, fraternity. And there isn't a clear path to individual rights and freedom. It may look like that. And he's not simplifying Hobbes and Locke, but it's not without some struggle when you talk about individual freedom. There has to be, at least in this consent model, or what he would call the general will, how do we continue to perfect our abilities to reason and our sensibilities to work through these contradictions? Because if we move too quickly, if we don't think through the deep roots, which you all are doing, you're living it, you're building the societies, you're imagining and actualizing the social change. If we don't really think deeply and work through those contradictions, even the so-called modern democracy that emerges can quickly turn tyrannical. That's very troubling. He had such a prophetic view. Let's debate this in our discussion. What's happening to democracies all over the place? Look at the U.S. Look at other um, countries. What do we mean by this resurgence of the right wing that's, on the one hand, depoliticizing itself, using its violence and hegemony to push through extra constitutional processes to accelerate the changes they want to see based on one vision, which violates the rights of many minorities? Moral problems inherent in even established democracies. Okay, so it took a very long time, and we'll introduce the 19th century model of utilitarianism in depth. You may consider this simplistic, but for many people, it is still the foundations of classical economics and what Rawls would call capitalist property owning democracies. What does it say? Greatest good for the greatest number of people. That sounds great. If you look at the aggregate or the GDP, how many people are consuming, how much are they consuming, how much is the value of all the goods consumed, and you measure the wealth and you say, oh, wow, that's great. Got a big GDP, everybody must be happy. The US, China, India, Brazil, is everybody happy? Maybe a simplification. But the assumption is that if you satisfy desires through the consumption of commodities, then um, and you do that for the greatest number of people in society, not by stratification or caste or hierarchy or privilege, then the society must be doing good. Well, the way you achieve that is through a division of labor that we have to respect, that the state has to respect. And the more we can perfect the different types of divisions without compromising social mobility, the more we're forced to compete. And if we can compete, like any capitalist system, we can continue to perfect those commodities. The pricing will adjust itself. The quote unquote invisible hand from Adam Smith will make any corrections. But the whole point of this is not just to create wealth for the sake of wealth, it's to capture that to regulate the society with good social policies. So this is still kind of like a standard assumption. It's more complicated than I'm presenting, but I want to show the contrast. Who's Rawls? Why would he come around in 1971 and say, you know what? This has been around for 100 years, but I think we need something different. His later works would talk about social democracies, socialist democracies, laissez-faire democracies, non-democracies, um, and all the different variations. But just within the standard idea of a liberal, democratic, capitalist democracy, can we imagine another framework? So what was his framework? The egalitarian model. And I want to bring this into discussion with Ambedkar, who, of course, worked decades before Rawls. Maybe Ambedkar had the original vision, and maybe one can argue, but in an entirely different context. Post-colonial, in Nepal, non-colonial, global South context. How do we build just institutions that can be held accountable publicly to the for and by and to the least privileged in society? Now, the definition of least privilege is going to be different, obviously, for different societies. We'll end up talking about caste, of course, when we talk about a Hindu majoritarian context in India and Nepal. What are his basic ideas? He assumes that, any rational individual in any society would want to achieve what he calls primary social goods. I'm not saying I agree with this. This is what he agrees with. And if you talk to most people in capitalist democratic systems, perhaps this is what they feel are the primordial values. So maximal liberty, inequality of rights for all. I don't dispute that. Social mobility. You're born into a certain class or caste or geography or identity or tradition, caste. You should have the fundamental right to escape intergenerational traps and rise. If you're going to live in capitalism, let's just admit it. You probably want some level of wealth and property. Positions of power and leadership. Some of your countries talk about reservations. We don't exactly have that in our system here in the US, but the whole point is that everybody should have at least the opportunity to capture positions of power and leadership, regardless of protected category. So let's say in the US Constitution, race, ethnicity, caste, let's include that, regardless of background. Here's the most elusive: dignity, the dignity initiative that you created. Dignity is the basis of self-respect. That is the most difficult. Okay, what's his experiment? He just has this hypothetical experiment, what he calls the original position and the veil. Kind of like you can't see. Let's say all of us, we can't see each other, we don't know each other, we all enter into a room, we all have the same voice, there's some modulation. You cannot assume what our gender, race, ethnicity, caste, nationality, class, but nothing about us, just anonymous beings. But somehow we have the basic facts of the natural and social sciences. So we go into this little room. He thinks if for a theory of justice, we would at least come up with these two principles. He talked about two, maybe there are more. So all of us somehow would agree to what these are. Again, equal rights and liberties to all, not just some groups, even though a democratic constitution confirms that. Equal opportunity for all, be foreclosed. So that's part A of the second principle. And then B, capitalist democracies, again, that defend property and wealth exist, but should be distributed in a manner that benefits the least privileged in society, what he calls maximizing the minimum. That's the famous difference principle. There are going to be differences and inequalities. If you want to live in a capitalist democracy, you tell me what you think. I will keep my views secret, not just because we're recording, but this isn't the space to talk about Buddhism and Marxism. I have separate talks on Ambedkar's Buddha and the Karl Marx, but I'd love to talk to you about that. But here for this discussion, there are going to be inequalities, but who's going to tell us on the moral threshold how bad can it be as so extreme as to compromise either of the two principles? You tell me, what was the Gen Z revolution against corruption, against hierarchy, against intergenerational privilege, against the Nepo babies? I don't know if you use that term, but we use that in American English. Or any kind of structure of privilege. And not just the political and economic structure of it. That's terrible, isn't it, in its own right? Morally egregious. But when we get into caste, the indignity, the dehumanization. The US, we talk about the legacy of black slavery, native genocide, treatment of all racial minorities today, as you can see. Or think of Western Europe and their minorities. But here in the South Asian context, we'll talk about indigeneity, religious minorities, but we have to talk about caste, the least privileged. Okay, now the sharp transition. And Prashant or Roop, you can just signal to me how much time I have, and then I can be mindful. I don't know when we started, but if I'm okay, then.
Oh, you're okay. You can carry on, Professor Sampath, as long as you would like to finish.
Oh, I think hopefully just another 20 minutes, hopefully less.
Yeah.
Okay, so I say this, I have to qualify this because I was raised basically from birth, infancy, 3 months old, here in the US, and never really left until later in my life to learn, experience not only my own South Asian roots, but to be in South Asia. India as a visiting scholar, 2012, and Nepal recently. Haven't been to other South Asian countries. And it was a simultaneous discovery because of the Dalit students that came to my university before the anti-caste discrimination policy was born, before the caste journal came into existence, and the legacy of conference. But learning from the students of Dalit background about the persistence of caste. that I had my kind of awakening, and then to be introduced to the works of Ambedkar, not having grown up with them. But I always felt that, okay, that's great, having all this Western ideas and knowledge and frameworks. It's important, but they're inherently limited because we have to enter a space of existential complexity, psychological complexity that you have embodied, having lived it your lives, and some of you, and me from the outside, but also on the inside to a certain extent. So I have to be ethically responsible in how I understand these Western models. But there are other structural reasons why they're limited. Hence the excitement of your journal, this dignity, the Dignity Initiative, the global series and the lectures and the gathering is that we don't have to just adopt what was created in the 20th century and prior. We need something different, and you're working that out. So I find inspiration in Ambedkar, the anti-caste social movement leader, a thinker, architect of the modern democratic Indian constitution, and his significance. I think he's a remarkable figure because think about this. If I think of civil rights leaders, let's say in the American context, if I think of the founding figures of the Constitution, they're rarely the same human being. And I think of great thinkers. I just mentioned John Rawls. Who was influential? How can you be one human being of Dalit origin and live the lives of three or four human beings and excel in a manner, to me, that supersedes any of the upper castes and their contributions? Is that a strong statement? It is, but that's how I feel. So I just don't even understand the mystery of who this human being was. How can you be this person? And think about that from the position of the oppressed. Lifelong works to abolish caste. But look at this, create a social vision for true democracy. Gandhi and the founding figures, decolonizing. And then the partition, of course, Jinnah and Pakistan. But think about the birth of the constitutional democracies during the decolonization. He's decolonizing the internal colonization in the colonial structure of caste, and of course pre-colonial roots down to the ancient times, the Manusmriti and its adoption of the Vedic heritage, but that consolidation of caste 2,000 years ago. He's decolonizing the internal colonization in a colonial structure that's decolonizing against the external Western colonizer, the British. That's how there's a gem there buried. I mean, we got the constitutional democracies after independence. And I'm going to turn to Nepal, which is a unique space because it's not colonized. But what do we can't just have the decolonization and the birth of democracy. We have to have this deconstruction of the internal colonization of caste. That's profound to me. That's so profound. I think of the black struggle after slavery, the amendments that abolished slavery. But you get segregation, separate but equal. You have to overturn that. That's not enough. You still need the civil rights to guarantee the equal primary social goods that Rawls talks about. And then here in the US, many of us feel like the deterioration of that because you look at the struggles onwards up to Black Lives Matter. Why would we have a Black Lives Matter 50 years after a civil rights revolution for the liberation of Black people? So you think about that trajectory. Compare that to the caste questions today in India, Nepal, and where it exists. We can highlight insights from his practical philosophy. A lot of you care about the practical, actualization. How do we, he's a great mind. He can talk about the social philosophy, but you want practical transformation. And I don't know enough, and I don't want to simplify the applied ethics and liberation theologies that come out of the Theravada and Mahayana traditions of Eastern Buddhism. Some of which may support democracy, some of them don't. I mean, I don't want to point fingers at the complexity of Myanmar today or look at the long, complex history of Sri Lanka, but, the Metacrite Buddhism is a different type. As Christopher Queen, the scholar of Ambedkarite Buddhism, has discussed. It is salient. It has prospects about a secular democracy. That sounds like a contradiction. So let's turn to his work, and the Buddha and his Dhamma. These are actual quotations. I can't go through everything, of course. It'll take too much time. But if you can indulge me, give me permission, I just want to read some very powerful parts of this book 4, where he's actually defining the crux of for him, the Buddhist philosophy. as a social system and a moral system against religion. The Dalai Lama, I think, wrote a book. It was some time ago. Very intriguing title. Ethics Without Religion. Coming from the Dalai Lama, the figure of Tibetan Buddhism. But as you know, if you look at the whole book and all of Ambedkar's works, there's a profound critique of the nature of religion itself. He's not. You don't have to point fingers at this religion or that religion, and not necessarily Hinduism itself. Just religion as a concept. He says it's personal. One must keep it to oneself. Okay, is that true of all religions, or no? We can debate that. One must not let it play its part in public life. Is that the secular concept? But contrary to this, what he understands from the original Buddhist inspiration, from the Buddha himself, the Dhamma is social. It fundamentally and essentially so. Dhamma is righteousness, which means right relations between man and man, human and human in all spheres of life. From this, it's evident that one man, if he's alone, does not need Dhamma. But where there are two men living in it in relation to each other, they must find place for Dhamma whether they like it or not. They can't escape it. You know, that social contract theory, all those contradictions that you think about how skeletal Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau were. That's not what we're talking about per se. We're talking about something else. Let's see what it is. What does society, and you look at this, we can talk about let's take India and Nepal today, and I invite people from other countries to share their views. What can we do? Society can choose one of three alternatives. Society may choose not to have any Dhamma as an instrument of government. Dhamma is nothing if it's not an instrument of Dhamma, according to Ambedkar. You don't have this, you're going to go to anarchy, that state of nature. Or society may choose the police, dictatorship, state violence, state power, centralized power. As you can imagine, no democracy as the instrument of government. Or society can choose a Dhamma, magistrate wherever people fail to observe the Dhamma. In anarchy and dictatorship, liberty is lost. Only in the third does it survive. So I'll pause there. There's a lot more he's saying about prajna and karuna and love. Prajna is understanding, but let's keep moving for the sake of time. Okay, this I can spend a little more time. Here he's making a contrast between religion and morality. This is very profound, very unsettling, because a lot of people who are in religions will say, well, what do you mean? I'm in the religion because it's a moral system. It tells me what's right and wrong and what I need to do and how can I be good to people? How can I have salvation? I'm afraid of dying and I don't know what's going to happen after I die. There has to be an absolute God that protects me because otherwise life is meaningless. All the traditional conceptions of religion. But he says, what is the place of morality and religion? I'm so amazed, I mean, he's from the 1910s, 20s, 30s. I think the Annihilation of Caste is 1936. And also living out this revolution, the independence movement, but his own lifelong critique of caste. And then thinking these ideas. Of course, he's influenced by some Western roots. He trained in Columbia University under the great American philosopher John Dewey. Went to England, did the law and economics. So of course he has some of the Western roots, but this is miraculous. He's conceptualizing these, and it's so powerful for that time period. I'm trying to imagine maybe some other Western critics that exist, like Bertrand Russell, the great analytic philosopher. He wrote a book saying why I'm not a Christian and trying to give a defense of his atheism. Controversial for the time, still is, but there are examples. But here's Ambedkar in the South Asian context. What is the place of morality? Really, matter of truth, morality has no place in religion. Religion consists of God, soul, prayers, worships, rituals, ceremonies, sacrifices. And in the opening of the Buddha and Dhamma, he takes us through a lineage, how religion was born, and it end up with a God-fearing human of some absolute that justifies stratification, difference, oppression through ritualistic systems. And for those of us that want to critique the caste, the pure-impure distinction, which, as you know, is attributed to people. Pure, Brahmin, oppressed, impure, outsider, other, demonic, excluded, and justifies the oppression of them because of their impurity. So morality only comes when there is true human relation to human, man to man. Morality comes in a religion as a side wing to maintain peace and order. Religion is a triangular piece when you think about religion, morality and religion. He's going to go to morality and Dhamma in a second, but he's talking about religion here. Be good to your neighbor because you're both children of God. That's the argument of religion. So it's a principle, it's a concept, but it's not a lived practice. Religion preaches morality, but morality is not the root of religion. It's a wagon attached to it. It is attached and detached as the occasion requires. See, it's very arbitrary when you bring morality into religion. It's so, the insights here are so amazing because everybody wants to think of religion and morality as the same thing. The action of morality and the function of religion is therefore casual and causal maybe, and occasional. It's not continuous. It's not guaranteed. Morality and religion is not effective. So what is effective? Dhamma and morality. What is the place of morality in Dhamma? The simple answer is morality is Dhamma, and Dhamma is morality. Look at this. Dhamma takes the place of God. And although there is no God in Dhamma, now don't think of atheism. The question is not simply, I don't want to believe in God, and I just, or any kind of religion, and I just live and I die, I'm made of matter, and I just disappear. Let's not get into Marxism and the critique of religion and the communist philosophy just yet as a type of atheism, because there's conversations about Marxism and religion that are more complicated than just Marxism as an atheist philosophy. But let's just suspend for a second, taking the place, a whole other type of holiness or divine that's rooted in the true liberty, equality, and fraternity of people as the final antidote to this caste system that's been around forever. Still exists, you know it. And maybe in some senses getting worse, depending on how you view it. But in the Dhamma, there's no place for prayers, pilgrimages, rituals, ceremonies. All those things presuppose hierarchies, separations in social space. If you're going to get into prayer, purification, ceremony, you're assuming something's impure. Morality for Ambedkar is the essence of Dhamma. Without it, there is no Dhamma. Direct necessity for the human love for human. There is the charitable notion and concern for the stranger and the suffering in Judaism. Hebrew Bible. The Ten Commandments. Jesus as the center of God, core piece of Christianity, talks about love and is love, and apparently died to spread that love, given the quote unquote sinfulness of humanity. And Islam has its structures with regard to an egalitarian philosophy. We can talk about that. So you can say, Ambedkar, what about those three, for example? And maybe perhaps others. Well, we know that he did examine other religions. Maybe not as closely as he could, but he did. And he spent his whole life to get to that point, but he chose Buddhism. Could it be one simple reason is that you don't need to assume the existence of a God to have this kind of, let's call it religiosity of the secular structure that works? I mean, again, the goal is to have the true equality and liberty, what the Western guys promised in their social contract. Still doesn't exist. It does not require the sanction of God. It is not to please God that man has to be moral. How do you develop this kind of human? It's like the first ever human conception of morality for humans without God. Okay. Yeah, I won't be able to read all of this. I can just summarize it real quick, but the point is that these ideas of the sacred and the profane, this evolutionary truth about survival, which could be based on that state of nature and self-interest. When you mix the two together, bad things happen. Hierarchies get fixed. People are excluded. That he calls that the original state of society. And he thinks the false origin of morality, we don't have to read this whole text, but the false origin of morality comes from this fear-based idea of transcending the state of nature. which in a way is kind of like that Western contract. That's why we can't just rely on their ideas. We may need something different. And his paradox is that out of this, morality takes the social and it actually makes it very antisocial. Because in the name of morality, let's say in certain systems, there are still thieves. What about the morality among the business people, among the craftspeople, about robbers? Everyone can talk about their own morality at some point if they're defending their own group. Well, what does the nature of corruption mean to you? How do we finally eradicate it? And by the way, it's not about the West pointing fingers at the global South and the East, let's say in African countries or throughout the world. Think about what's happening here. Okay, what is this continued critique? Morality is not enough. It has to be sacred and universal. He's redefining the sacred. But this is what will lead us to, I think, our conclusions. I have some questions for our discussion, but let's finish with Ambedkar. A society, you tell me about your context. A society which rests upon the supremacy of one group over another, irrespective of its irrational proportionate claims, inevitably leads to conflict. Caste hierarchy, racial hierarchy, gender hierarchy, patriarchy. If you want to go down this path, many people don't discuss it, but the rights of LGBTQ peoples as a minority, given the hetero majority. Citizen over immigrant, national identity over displaced peoples or transnational peoples. But obviously, when we think of caste, we think of the Brahmanical supremacy over, first of all, anybody that's not that, but the upper castes, of course, over the majority of lower castes. But this whole issue of the excluded other, the Dalit, and then tribal peoples. The only way to put a stop to conflict is to have common rules of morality which are sacred to all, set universalism. True interpenetration of equality is an idea into the citizens of all, maximizing the minimum, attuned to the least privileged, and their voice for justice. For Rawls, that's where that begins, not the utilitarian majority, whatever that is. Under the struggle for existence or under group rule, the interests of the individuals are not safe. The group setup prevents an individual from acquiring. When you just have this tribalism and not tribal peoples, but distinctions that are made between different groups. The group setup prevents an individual from acquiring consistency of mind, which is possible only when society has common ideals, common models. His thoughts are led astray, and this creates a mind whose seeing unity is forced and distorted. Groups over others, groups living within constitutional democracies, group thinking in general against other groups. How do we break that? How do we see each other as one common humanity, one set of, two individuals like us? Look at us, we're all different, but we see each other as a family. This group ideal leads to discrimination and denial of justice, which a lot of us are working on. Of course, it leads to stratification of classes. Those who are masters remain masters, and those who are born in slavery remain slaves. Owners remain owners, workers remain workers, the privileged remain privileged, and the serfs remain serfs. It cannot be liberty for some, but not for all. About Rawls said in the first principle. This means that there can be equality for a few, but none for the majority. Liberty for all, equality for all, and the last piece, though, which is the hardest to achieve, fraternity. What is that? What is the remedy? Fraternity universally effective. The Buddha and the Karl Marx, he said, hey, at least with Marx, maybe we get liberty and equality. Or sorry, we get equality and fraternity, but there isn't an example of a democratic Marxist structure right now. There's centralized states, China, like North Korea, or a guy like Putin. Oh yeah, it's a democracy after the Cold War. Is it? What is it? I don't know. But he goes, no, I don't know. I want all three. Can Buddhism give me the path? What is fraternity? It's nothing but another name. Brotherhood of men. I'll say humanity, so it can be gender inclusive, which is another name for morality. So morality out of religion. Morality takes the place of God. Now let's take the place of morality. Let's talk about fraternity. He preached the Dhamma as morality, Dhamma as sacred, so is now. Okay. Conclusions. And I'd like us to maybe, as we transition to our discussion, we can talk about two things. I want to talk, I'm centering Nepal here, but let's invite the Indian perspectives, this discussions that are happening that we know of about the global diaspora of South Asians in the UK, the US, Canada, the three I'm becoming more familiar with the US, but I'm learning about UK and Canada on anti-caste movements. But I want to focus on Nepal for a moment because I know we have people that are currently living through the transformation and are very interested. But let's not lose sight of this arc that's affecting the Indian context, at least for the last 12 years. Okay. Conclusions for Nepal as the only non-colonial South Asian country. And the title there is because it's not that there's no trace of Western influence. There is a complex history of Western, during the colonial periods, obviously, the rest of South Asia, from the British, parts of the French, and I guess the Portuguese, maybe the Dutch. But it's extraordinary because you have a non-colonial structure with, as far as I can tell, and you teach me what the statistics are, roughly 86% Hindu majority, but with the Buddhist roots, the birthplace of the Buddha. Of course, smaller religious minorities statistically, if you look at the percentages, whatever the census says, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity. Of course, the very complex issue of tribal spiritualities. Ambedkar's thought is relevant in the quest to abolish caste and establish the moral underpinnings of a secular, constitutional, pluralistic, diverse democracy. Excuse me. It may not be accepting Ambedkar's view about Buddhism and the Dhamma, or let's say the Hindu appropriation of the Buddhistic elements, which is what I witnessed in Nepal. Some syncretism, which is not what you might find in different Indian contexts. But the relevance of the thinking that we saw in the Buddha and Dhamma transferred to this context. And you teach me that given the immense geographic, ethnic, tribal, religious minorities, caste complexities of the Hindu majority, the prospects for a parliamentary democracy that advances inclusive social policies while promoting growth and development. If I think of a place, that's actually happening right now. The promise is amazing. The challenges, though, are difficult, structural, intergenerational, seemingly permanent. One doesn't have to be a pessimistic person, but we shouldn't be naively optimistic. The transformation that's coming, what does that really mean for these profound questions of liberty, equality, fraternity? An ideal that no society's achieved, let's be honest, but that's why we aspire. Can Nepal become the first example of a non-colonized South Asian society to create a secular, pluralistic, diverse democracy that takes the best elements of the Western social contract tradition, but combining it with the wisdom of Ambedkar on Buddhist social philosophy? So I will stop sharing here and just a few more reflections. I guess what I'm trying to say is I said this in Paul, that I want to learn more. The temporal horizon, when you think of historical time, of a place like Nepal, and let's compare and contrast with the temporal horizon of a post-colonial, massive post-colonial history, which is India. South Asia before the partition. We can think about Pakistan's context, pre and post-partition, and it's the same with Bangladesh, which came later. And those that have perspectives about Sri Lanka, that will be interesting. But, can we think about, can we talk about secularism? What can secularism mean for you? Why innately, if we're going to do away with group and hierarchy, self-interest, which runs everything, unfortunately, but respect something like diversity and pluralism, which you have in, let's say, the context of Nepal and India. You can't erase those differences. And we can't just live on paper an abstract concept of being equal citizens. For example, we're not just living in that room of John Rawls with the veil, where we continue to just say there are no differences between us, we don't even know who we are, and hey, we got these two principles, and we're just gonna, that's it. No, we have this complex diversity of traditions and values and the respect of different religious pluralisms. How do we respect those differences, but remove all those things Ambedkar said about stratification and self-interest and domination? So abstract conceptions of equality, liberty, fraternity as democratic citizens, but the preservation of pre-colonial, non-colonial structures. The works I've read on Nepal is that if you don't start with the local, think about how diverse and dispersed geographically and then the complexity of the terrain, you know, buffered between China and India. And then take the Indian context, of course, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. But if you don't attend to that complex diversity and respect it, but make it work in terms of a functioning secular constitutional democratic system, then what should the policy considerations be? And you can tell me, maybe you can focus on some issues that you're interested in. For example, the persistence and the need for reservations. How do we feel about that? What's missing currently for certain groups and their rights and what they're fighting for? Or we can get more philosophical. What do you feel is the way to finally abolish, annihilate caste? Or what is caste to you? I take a philosopher too, so I have different perspectives, but I want to hear from you. What is it, and what is it going to take to eradicate it if that's the goal? So secularism, pluralism, traditional values of different groups, the exercise of natural democracy, and the annihilation of caste. I know it's a lot, but I'm just putting it out there. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I hope it wasn't too rushed, and I think we have plenty of time for conversation and discussion. I think you're on mute, Prashant.
Prashantji, you are muted.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Sampath, for your insightful lecture, and thank you for traversing the whole, spectrum of Western social contract theory, critical theory, and relating the same with the work of Rawls, Ambedkar, and Marx, even Hobbes, and contextualizing it with the current scenario in South Asia, especially related to Nepal. So thank you so much. We enjoyed your lecture. I really enjoyed your lecture, and it gave me certain points of view to think about certain problems, especially how you conceptualize the notion of eradication of caste and decolonization of caste, bringing in the question of morality at the center stage. And now I can see in the chat box that we have a lot of questions for you, and I hope you're ready for that. But it's not
Sure.
it's not going to be quick fire. You can take your time. And we have the first question is by Dr. Drona, who has also given a lecture here previously. So he is his question is that the idea of God has been inculcated in the minds of people, and along with it, there are issues of superstition and fear in the minds of people. So he is asking whether that undermines morality, and if so, how can the notion of Dhamma help us to overcome this sort of fear?
That's a great point. And also I want to acknowledge Dr. Drona's point. Exactly. I was naive to say non-colonial, no colonial influence. I want to read his chat. Nepal is not entirely free of colonial influence. The Rana regime in Nepal, like several principalities in India, was subjugated to British colonists and had all the colonial impacts during the British Empire. There are reason to believe that the draconian law of the Civil Code was formulated very much with colonial influence. Okay, so let's not be naive about these. The boundaries are more permeable about the entire South Asian context, what are officially colonial and what is called historically non-colonial. Obviously, there's interpenetration. But to get back to first Dr. Drona's question, many early sociologists of the 20th century, Durkheim was one, but if we take Ambedkar's work, and tracing this kind of genealogy of the birth of religion itself, fear of the outside, inability to explain natural changes, need for prediction and predictability, let's say grain storage for 7,000 BC, the early cities. What emerged? Eventually these later civilizations would emerge, and of course with them, these conceptions of religion. But at least there should have, as he said, Ambedkar said in the philosophy of Hinduism, there should have been a shift for Hinduism where, like other places, where the fear moved from obedience and fear of God because our lack of understanding of ourselves and the need to be given morality to the internalization of morality, that feeling of fraternity and true feeling of liberty and equality, should shift this fear of God to the centrality of concern for human beings' welfare, each as individuals. That shift should take place. And if it does take place in religion, it's great. He claims that if I use justice and the usefulness of a religion to promote that equality and freedom, he's putting Hinduism on trial. And he says, well, unfortunately, Hinduism fails. Therefore, this question of morality and why did he choose Dhamma as like the internal practice, the social actualization of it, the actual words of the Buddha, these debates between the Pali and other formations. But it's an appropriation, if you will, of the Buddhist tradition. It's not a question, do we all have to become Buddhists? He wants to take some of the ideas and the philosophies to imagine a secular democracy. But one thing has to be, I guess I put it back on all of us, can post-colonial global South democracies, do we ask, how do we finally get rid of the religiosity and the religion? That permeates everything, that, the entire social fabric of these societies. Is that the question, or is it this kind of true civic feeling and attitude where I want to see the other as my true equal? I don't want to think about blood lineage. I don't want to think about my name. If I'm assigned a caste, that doesn't come into play. Those have to vanish in an instant. And the only two beings that are left are two human beings that have to care for each other. If you want to call that love, you can call that love. But the point is, how does that get translated into a functioning secular democratic system? It has to be those primary goods from Rawls. Can you tell me what emerges now, or those of you that are doing the measurements of disparities and inequalities? Take those 5 primary social goods if you're living in a capitalist democratic system, which we all are. Are those equally achieved as opportunities and distributed fairly to all groups? No. So then the question is why? Is that linked back to a fundamental fear of those that have the privilege? Of course, those that have the privilege, as walking around like gods that they think they are, including the guy running our country right now, that they just make the law. As my mentor Derrida said, those Western democracies talking about how pure they are and how secular they are, and look at the rest of the world, they can't do it. The beast is below the state of law in nature, like Hobbes. But a beast is also above the law when you transcend it. When you take sovereign conceptions of blood and you mix it with power, and you create a false distinction between the state and then some lineage that's royal and one that's priestly, bad things will happen. There'll never be equality. The mixing of sovereignty and lineage is terrible. Well, in democracies, that shouldn't exist. And yet for him, it can reinvent itself. It may not look like the pre-democratic monarchies of the past. We call it oligarchy here. We call it techno-capitalist oligarchies. But groups that maintain that privilege, as Ambedkar said, we care about destroying that privilege. So I put the question back to the group. How is Nepal and India going to achieve this final destruction of privileged structures in this society? Or do we believe that there's true equality that exists already? We don't need to worry about that. I don't think so. We think they're privileged structures that need to be dismantled. Okay. Is that?
Yeah. Thanks. So next question is from Roopji, which he has put through his organization Dignity Initiative. So he's talking about his question is that many political parties and academicians, universities, everybody seems to be appropriating the ideas and philosophy of Ambedkar. So and his philosophy seems to be transcending the locational boundaries or spatial boundaries of his own location, which so his question basically is like, how would you critically analyze the manner in which he is being appropriated? Does it dilute the ideas of Ambedkar, or does it give them an enhanced application based orientation?
That's a great question, Rup, and thank you, Dr. Prashant. Is it a trade-off? It's better to have greater visibility, even if the privileged groups, the upper castes, and of course the grammatical structures, appropriating it, using it, presenting it. My analogy is drawing from my learnings, my inspiration from the Black intellectual tradition here in the U.S. So from Frederick Douglass after slavery all the way up to a thinker like Cornel West. But this long struggle too, that's 400 years old. It may not be thousands of years old like caste, but think about that most heinous form of human suffering, which would be the Atlantic slave trade. The UN just passed a resolution calling for reparations. And of course, the US said no. But slavery is the most horrific event, the longest, and it would require reparations for the slave trade from Africa. But Cornel West discussed the appropriation of Martin Luther King by the reinvention of white structures. The way one answer is respecting the intellectual genius and voice of the oppressed that comes from Black thinkers and scholars, increasing the number of Black people in the pipeline of PhDs and academics and scholars and thinkers. So analogously, we have to work. I don't know if the method is reservations, because you all can dispute that, but we have to increase the number of, find and increase the number of Dalit students, for example, tribal or other excluded groups who are statistically misrepresented by virtue of their percentage of the population. In Nepal, I heard 13%, I hear 20%, I hear the undercounted. India is doing their census now. But we're talking about a large number of people. For the US, we have 15% Black. Well, what percentage of every those 5 primary goods? All the institutions. So the appropriation is an issue. It's not just the means justify the ends, at least there's visibility. I think we need something more radical, which is, because I care about the production of new knowledge, the activation of the Dalit mind in excellence in what's called epistemology, to teach us how to rethink almost everything. How do we imagine history? What's philosophy? Maybe we go into Ambedkar's practical realms. Do we think about economics and distribution and land? Do we think about rethinking the Constitution itself? Abolishing untouchability is one thing, and banning caste discrimination is one thing, but it didn't say banning the caste system. Our U.S. Constitution says no discrimination on the basis of race. It didn't say get rid of racism. And those of you that may not be familiar, just turn on the news. We have plenty of racism. Didn't go away. So the appropriation is a problem, but I think those of us that understand the radical need is radical activation on a massive scale of opportunities for those educational opportunities, health opportunities, and I guess positions of power, wealth, and property. Until that happens, I don't see a structural transformation that can occur.
Thank you again. I think it's more related to epistemic skepticism. If we are able to read philosophers and thinkers over time, then we would know that that knowledge has progressed from one philosophy to another, and even Ambedkar to a great extent was influenced by the struggle of the Black community when he was studying in the United States. So
Yeah.
the Dalit Panthers movement in India is largely borrowed from the Black Panthers in the United States. And the work that he did, under Western philosophers, he was able to contextualize that, in his own thinking about the caste system in India. So it's broadly our skepticism as to whether, he some thinkers are relevant for other societies or not. Like, I think this is the primary reason why we brought this dialogue together, was to learn from the experiences and the struggles of activists and the works of academics like yourself, and contextualize the same to understanding the problem of marginalized social groups and caste and social exclusion in various locations across the world. But of course, there are like questions which you brought up of morality within, how to use philosophies within certain locations as well. So next question that we have is from Anchal, who is a PhD scholar working with me, and she wants to know, like, how caste-based hierarchies, why do they continue to structure everyday relations, and like and do you think that democracies like India remain merely procedural? And then she goes on to ask, like, that how can such concepts of fraternity and dhamma help us to overcome such entrenched hierarchies and the biases that people themselves hold. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you, Anshul. And Les Ambedkar himself, or, let's not forget the intersectional nature. I just thought about this, but somehow the grammatical critique of the grammatical structure, and the critique of patriarchy itself is a question that we have to address. And all other intersectional minorities. For me, all the different types of oppressed groups, if they find the solidarity intersectionally of what they have in common with regard to their types of exclusion, then we promote collectively a greater number of people, obviously, that can then fight for a radical change. But the pessimism you mentioned, Prashant, earlier, to respond to Anshul's question, what is it? Why does it persist? That's a deep question that, at least from before the time of Ambedkar, going back to Fule, maybe others, but certainly in the 20th century, so many different people, we're all thinking about it. Many of you are social scientists. I come from the humanities, so I like to take from philosophy. Even though I presented this social contract tradition and theories of democracy, I don't actually subscribe. I have to confess. I need something more radical than that. I studied Marx, and the critical theory tradition comes from those European and Western thinkers who subjected their own Western society, and Christianity in particular, to a virulent critique. I mean, such a deep level of critique that it would blow your mind. But you'd first have to understand, it's difficult for all of us, including me, even though I was raised here, that unless you descend from this structure and to see how powerful their critiques were internally about their own systems. And those are people but we could sort of look at. Ambedkar did what he did with regard to his Western influences, not to praise these Western guys for how great they are, but just look at how are they doing their critiques? How did Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals get to the very depths? And then I go to Ambedkar and I see him doing something similar with regard to his Hinduism, a grammatical version of it. And then, as he said, the counter-revolution, the Buddhist inventions that were then appropriated, taken over, and then snuffed out. And of course, Buddhism was pushed out to everywhere else. Further to the east. But we have to be able to perform this radical philosophical critique of everything. Because you may say, well, caste isn't everything in a South Asian structure. Let's just say India and Nepal, where there are Hindu majorities, which is not the case for Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. We're not saying that, but we are saying that, as he said, if it's the nucleus, the crux of what people fear the most, what they have to cling to, let's say the principle of transmigration of souls, which is a paradox, because if it's going to keep moving, it should keep going up and down and wherever. So why is it every time someone's born, we're stuck in the same generation from the previous, with that same location, same occupation, same humiliation and degradation? You're going to have social mobility of the soul, but not the body. So we have to perform these types of profound critiques. But the cost, I think, is great. I don't want to sound like I'm condescending, but you tell me, regardless of our fields and backgrounds, you live in this dense religiosity. Let's say those of you that are in Nepal and India, or many places. Unless I go to the dense religiosity of the evangelical white supremacist structures that still believe everything they believe about Christianity at the same time, but justify the idea of whites requiring separation from everybody else and the exclusion of everybody else. Unless I go inside those structures, it's very hard for me to understand how to work within it, if not make a critique. I can make the outside critique of it, and I do. But I similarly am doing that with regard to Hinduism, Hindu metaphysics, drawing from Ambedkar's works. But I don't feel like, you tell me. I mean, the social transformation. I asked this in my class. What is your definition of atheism? And why can't that be your antidote for your Gen Z? Because I see a lot of hungry Gen Z in the South that may not be able to do that practically. Like, take, for example, in India right now, is it possible to run on an atheistic platform that positively, absolutely tries to critique the Hindu and the kind of Hinduization of majoritarian politics? If like that's your target, could you succeed? Could you do that in Africa? Christianity and Islam? Nepal, I don't know. That's you tell me. I don't know. I don't think it's no, not even Nepal. Anywhere else. You can say, well, that's not fair. You can't do that in the US. We've never had a president that didn't put their hand on the Bible. You know, like, no other person has ever been elected. It's not Christian, but they do it here too. So yeah, but you know, so I don't know. Is atheism the antidote that doesn't lead to Marxism, but still has his ideas about liberty and freedom and equality and perhaps distribution of resources and also the maintenance of wealth?
Yeah, thank you. So we have one question from Sumina Suwal, who is, I think, studying at Brandeis.
Yes, my
in
student.
Nepal. Oh yeah, she has a very interesting question, and she's bringing in the notion of if conflict can be solved by the moral framework that is sacred to all, and she's bringing in the notion of the morality of sacredness, and then talking about the fact that that whose morality are you talking about? Is we have and whose sacredness are you talking about? Because we have many people, diverse cultural traditions, diverse cultures, and so how can the sacredness of how can we agree to a universalized notion of sacredness, and whether that does subordinate other notions of sacredness? And don't you think that reproduces the very parsimmetry that generates conflict in the first place?
That's a great question, Samina, and we talked about this, and you're absolutely right. Maybe we need to deconstruct this. He retains the sacred, then he says universal. If he wants those universal principles of fraternity, equality, and liberty as constitutional, abstract, perhaps secular, quote unquote, atheistic structures, that's one thing. And yet he wants the sacred and the social whole other. And I agree with you. And you're coming from the Gen Z. If we're going to admit to pluralism, diversity, and respect the differences of values, the self-determination of individuals to be who they want to be, that's like the capabilities approach. Become whatever you want to be. Can I change my religion? If you want to go that far, change my gender. Be open about my sexuality if I'm not part of the hetero majority. Celebrate my community's values and traditions. How can I have the constitutional protections for those? You would think, therefore, do I subscribe to group rights as opposed to just individual rights that are abstract? Ambedkar is that if you have these groups, then either you may have conflict or differences, but if it's so, how come some groups get to rise to the top, use their privilege, maintain it, and exclude and oppress the rest of us? So how do you have it all almost? It's got the pluralism, the diversity, the commitment to individual rights and liberties, but this idea of social cohesion. You're right, it cannot be one universal morality because that seems very oppressive. On the other hand, I put the question back to you. We talk about this. I think he said somewhere in the Buddha and Dhamma, just being alone, if you're just going to be alone, which is impossible, then that you're not going to, that doesn't work with the Dhamma. The Dhamma is inherently social. You tell me, the social aspects of the democracy that should exist in the countries you want to see it in, India and Nepal, for example. The social factor that respects the intersectional minorities and differences comes with some trade-offs. Because what happens when some of the values are in conflict, like the issue of abortion in this country, the right to something could be the violation of somebody else. Well, minimally, we can at least try to eradicate things like segregation, separation. People should not be allowed to enter into certain spaces because of who they are. Temples and intercaste marriage. The best thing would be no caste, right? So there wouldn't be any intercaste marriage, it'd just be marriage. So I don't know. How do you promote the diverse set of values, but achieve the liberty and the equality? No one's figured that out, by the way, because it doesn't exist anywhere. Western Europe has its own problems with its minoritized groups, Islamic groups, for example, that need to preserve its values. How about the French banning all religious symbols in the public sphere? We would never do that in the US, as you know. First Amendment, free religious expression. Build a mosque on ground zero for the 9/11. So I want to know about the Nepal and India. What can work there? My
Thank you.
intuition is that the Gen Z is inclining towards a new type of secularism with the preservation of heritage and tradition and values like we talk about. Something new, I think, is emerging. And it's not just South Asian, many Gen Z parts of the different global South context.
Thank you, Dr. Sampath. We have another question from our PhD student, Chaudhry Shahrukh, and he's given you 4 questions, I can see. So the first question that he's asking is that in your presentation, you've spoken about Western theorists and scholars and their ideas about justice, morality, and society. And so the first question that he wants to ask is so where is Buddha and his teachings? Why they are not given such preference? Second question is, would you like to take it one by one, or would you like to take it together? Can you hear me, Dr. Sampath?
Yes. Well, the first one, and I don't know who sent it.
Shahrukh, Shahrukh.
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, that was my whole point, is to set up the West and say, look, this is limited. And it doesn't apply to the complexity, just like we're discussing now. I mean, we can know something about it, but I just think at the end of the day, it's limited. And I'm turning to Ambedkar for some inspiration so I can at least speak about the complexity of the South Asian context. 1. 2, I actually don't agree with this Western social contract tradition, which I'm supposed to promote. Because I come from a critical theory tradition of deconstruction recently, and then Marx and Nietzsche, and just these very strange, not Anglo-American. So I'm sorry for the British and white Americans. I say white because I appreciate the black intellectual traditions here and other groups that are oppressed. But the Europeans, so the French and the Germans, produce some very, very strange self-critiques, critiques of religion and society and human nature. And I come from that world, and I still think they're relevant if we can bring them into dialogue with global South figures, Eastern figures like Ambedkar, to create a brand new philosophy about human nature itself. In a way, it goes back to Samina's question. Honestly, I don't think anything is going to work from existing religious traditions, as far as I can see, and full philosophical traditions. Something new has to be invented. And one thing I point to is they talk about the lunar eclipse with the moon. Maybe it's going to happen. Like sometimes something happens, or a color it turns every 500 years. We've had this colonization. Nepal, I'll bracket, but most of the global South and the East has had this colonization since 1500. And we're wondering, what's the close going to look like when the West gets eclipsed and we'll see a new epoch emerge, where this is the postcolonial point, where you're not going to even use any of those Western frameworks to understand what's emerging. It should be produced from the global South and the East. We haven't had that chance for 500 years, but maybe for the young people, they may see something silhouette of a new horizon. So I'm not prioritizing the West.
His second question is basically related to that. So why do you think morality and religion are separate? At most times they seem to overlap, and he goes on to then talk about the notion of dharma as morality and not religion, and he cites Ambedkar by saying that that at one point of time Ambedkar is talking about dhamma as being something personal, and in the other side he's saying that that it's social. So how does Ambedkar connect dhamma to morality then?
Yeah, it's not me promoting the Dhamma and morality religion. I was just summarizing Ambedkar. Exactly. How does he have this internal transformation that the Buddha gives you, perhaps to escape caste, even though that's not always the case. When Dalits convert to Buddhism and then they face within the society the same type of exclusion, or converting to Islam or Christianity, it carries over the stigma. But how do you go from the individual enlightenment, which you would seem is the project, from suffering, detachment, attachment, suffering, the noble truths that suffering comes from desire. So you desire something, whether your desire can mean being so opposed to something or so greedy to get it, detached from that because it's going to lead to suffering. And suffering leads to dissolution and eventually death. So how do you overcome all this? It looks like an individual project. But then Ambedkar is really trying hard to make this into a type of social ethics, social philosophy about the love part, the compassion, the concern, and the actualization of that feeling. It's like a liberation theology. The analogy is in Latin America, the U.S. was going in there and destroying socialist democracies through its wars, putting in the dictators, oppressing the people, massive poverty and inequality in the 20th century. But those Christian liberation theologians said, look, telling the Vatican and the Catholic Church, this is the Catholic Church in Latin America, you want us to preach Christ and the good news and death, resurrection from death, and his social ethics, and all we see is poverty, death, inequality right in front of our face, we have to take a stance. And they fought for it, and many died. So I guess the analogy is, how far can you take the kind of Buddhist platform of detachment and turn it into some kind of social activism? And I guess the question comes back to us all, that at some point, some people feel that you mentioned Prashant, the Dalit Panthers. I mean, it seems to me no one fights, no one is going to give anything to an oppressed group. Every civil rights movement, it seems to me, is started by that group and achieved by that group. And then, of course, could disappear or it fails or the system co-opts it and then they're back to the same position. That's terrible, I know. But the point is that, we got to, it's the scaling of the Dalit activation across everything that I think it's a very abstract vision, but it's the only way I can think about realizing his Dhamma. It maybe make it more active.
All right, thank you. Now we have another question from Praneet Kaur, who is also our PhD student. She is her question is that if Dhamma becomes the moral basis of politics, then how would this kind of a framework guard against say electoral politics and violence?
Yeah, no guarantee. Some folks that may have other depth of perspective can tell me. I don't know. See, it seems to me we've always had an issue of the existing constitutional democracies protecting minority rights because of that clash of values, and clash of values can then become conflicts on any issue or topic. For example, I mentioned abortion. It becomes a religious divide. Here in this Western context, we talk about physician-assisted dying. Some countries have it. And I think about those countries, Belgium, Netherlands, I think Canada, they may join us up in Canada. Do they have more of the secular mindset? We have too much influence of the religious structure in our US context. That's why it's not a national law. They're banning gender affirming care for trans youth. the conservative religious bloc. So a lot of religion in the U.S. context. So you have a clash of values. How do you prevent it from becoming conflictual? I don't know. Again, it sounds like I'm not making. I know I'm not being clear. I apologize, but my dream is to see a South Asian like fine within Nepal and India, and then if I can ever get to Bangladesh and Pakistan and Sri Lanka, maybe Bhutan, find the indigenous roots and the consciousness of the oppressed groups, and begin like Ambedkar did to philosophize what the conception of human nature can be that's not naturally that doesn't naturally devolve back into identities. Like I ask folks, I ask anyone, the social component of your existence, this is a really just naive question. Does the social component of your existence in the Indian context, Nepal context, and commitments you have to whatever you want to say that is, beyond yourself, to a friend, to family, to community, to colleagues, to the local municipality, does that outweigh individual self-interest? And I guess the question is, could be to a large extent, yes. Because I can pose that question to some folks here in the US, maybe not Western Europe, and quite frankly, not Canada and Australia or New Zealand. I can give you plenty of individuals all the way up to the top where the answer would be the opposite. They will tell you that they put themselves first. So whether you call it the Dhamma or not, it's really about this question of the social component within the democracy. Is it functioning? Is it working within your systems? And that's a large question. You can't abandon the social. That's a good thing.
Thank you. We have now we take a question by Ratna, who's asking, who's basically asking you about whether Ambedkar did the right thing by shifting focus towards religious conversion rather than taking a political struggle all the way to maximizing the power gains and appropriation of other forms of surplus to the Dalit community. And do you think that that kind of an emphasis that Ambedkar had on converting to Buddhism, it basically further marginalized the Dalit population, which otherwise could have had gainfully been transformed by having access to political power?
Wow, what a great question. I think the question is the answer. I'd like to learn from you. Is it a personal struggle that he had about the stigma of the Dalit condition within the Hindu structure as a type of liberation praxis? Yes. But let's go back to his context in which he had to really struggle about issues of the separate electorate or the annihilation of caste. And we can talk about political and economic reform, but we got to talk about social reform. And he's saying, you know what? I tried. I talked to everybody. I said, look, let's do something. But the Shastras and the core anatomy of this thing is what, if you don't remove that caste structure from the system, then, it's not just leaving the system, meaning the system of Hinduism, because he stays in the society and does it further marginalized. But I think because by the 1940s and 50s, he saw the 1970, which you know my history, the Russian Revolution, and then what happened with Stalinism, and then wherever you want to say what else he would have been able to see for his time period, like how the Chinese system would have been relatively new in 1949, but same thing, similar thing, but you don't have that freedom and liberty. So maybe you get the fraternity and equality, but not liberty, with the secular Marxist structure. So, but I need the equality and the liberty from the secular democratic structure. But the secular democratic structure, if it comes into existence, it doesn't take care of stratification and inequality, then I don't have the fraternity. So that's how the Buddha and the Karl Marx were going. The dream would be to have all three, and as I mentioned, it doesn't exist as far as I know, anyway. Bhutan? I'm speculating, but they may be issues there. I mean, it's just a question of the primordial question, which for scholars anyway is, and for all of us, is this need to see difference to begin with. Does difference automatically turn into hierarchy? What would be the antidote to that? And if it turns out it's not religion, which promises a lot and maybe doesn't always deliver, and so far all existing models of Marxism have not come up with a democracy. Or is it the nature of the state itself, which is what some anthropologists who work on indigenous groups, is that this first Western conceived structure or concept of the state, going back to our friend Hobbes, and what it's become, which is a monster for some, was then given, kind of like that was the model that existed during decolonization in a lot of the global South and the East. What is your conception of the state? State is how progressive can a state be with regard to the most expansive types of social policies for the least privileged? Is what Rawls would ask. And I don't know. I don't know how's Nepal. What do people think? Or what's coming in India? Regardless of the political position of this particular government or party versus the Congress, what are the prospects? Excuse me.
Thank you. We have another question from our PhD student Sakshi, who's interested in knowing, that you talk about Rawls' ideas about basic liberties, and which includes freedom of expression, and how would that pan out in terms of digital spaces where we see that freedom of expression is seen to undermine dignity and equal participation?
Oh, so you say undermine. I thought one of the reasons, let's say in the Nepal issue with the Gen Z, was the shutting down of the social media, which is what a lot of other countries are. Non-democracies, of course, control it and they can shut it down. So free expression seems to be tantamount. But free expression comes from the liberty of conscience, just to be able to speak freely about what's right or wrong and openly in the public sphere. That should be the guaranteed freedom, publicly, but also in the digital space. But you're saying, I guess I have to understand the question better. Do we maximize freedom of expression on social media, which is happening anyway, because the internet space is it's a free-for-all now with AI. And of course, there are tremendous concerns about what's real and not real, fake or true, and et cetera, et cetera. This is the information age. As one of my mentors called it, the mode of information versus the mode of production in Marx. So what are you going to do to stop it, first of all? But two, I just think going back to that incessant need of some states it sounds like the global South. See, the West likes to point the finger, but look at what Trump did to shutting down types of free expression that we had prior. Not allowed to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, or transgender rights, or all kinds of issues. But by threatening, not direct control and imprisonment, but like withdrawing funds. But tell me about the Indian context, or tell me about, how come the Gen Z revolution started in Nepal? I thought it was about this issue of the use of social media. So I guess the question is that the place for emancipation? What I like about Gen Z's experimentation is it that not Rawls, but Rousseau, like an unencumbered place where you can experiment with debate and discussion to refine the sensibility to become more participatory citizens. That's like an optimistic view. The pessimist will say, well, it doesn't necessarily translate into actual social change. I don't know. Black Lives Matter, from what I remember, 2010 to now. The component obviously was based on the use of social media, but people taking pictures with their phones, or exchanging information, or the organization of the marches themselves, done by younger people. So that's a great question.
We have another question from our PhD student, Amisha, who wants to know whether there's some kind of a tension. Like, do you think there's some kind of a tension between Ambedkar's rationality and modernity and the spiritual basis of Buddhism on the other hand?
Those debates, Christopher Queen's works, tries to show how inclusive his vision of Buddhism is. And does it really relate to the manifestation of actual Buddhist traditions that exist today, wherever they exist around the world, and what forms do they take? There's different types of manifestations. You think of Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. But, to what extent they can come together. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about the Buddhist tradition myself. And quite frankly, I'm not a scholar of Ambedkarite Buddhism. But I'd like to see a genuine kind of discussion about a liberation theology, let's say from within the Dalit community, about like he listed the fundamental principles of the Buddhist in his Buddha and the Karl Marx, like the basic principles. But as you know, he was always interested in the project of the annihilation of caste and the creation of a true type of democracy based on those principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity. So that's really the project. Is some Western scholars, they talk about something called political theology. By that, they don't mean how do you use a religion to justify it, like a certain state or government. Our First Amendment says, we call it the joint. Like this is a joint, my elbow, and you see the flexibility. Government cannot be founded on a single religion. Let's say here in the US, got Christianity. It should be flexible enough to allow for the free religious expression of all other minority religions. Don't get in the way of the free religious expression, and don't found it on a single religion. So I'm sure Ambedkar would have to agree that we're not talking about founding it on a single religion. And if there is a respect for diversity, then you should allow for other expressions. The problem is that sounds great, but the reality is that one group comes to dominate, and they use their religious identity to marginalize other people that they don't agree with. Then they get really angry, which can lead to conflict and violence. So I myself probably would not go down this path of saying maybe it's just kind of the Marx side in me and it comes out, but also I have this thing called deconstruction, which is I just want to keep on reaching, aspiring beyond Rawls for more ideas about justice and what does it take to kind of actually achieve that. We have to have a deeper investigation philosophically.
Yeah, thank you for taking so much time to answer each and every question. Yeah, so I'm just going to take this opportunity to take certain references from your talk and just put in some concluding remarks, which probably many of us can think about. So, like, I particularly like your idea and your vision for the world order, and especially South Asia societies where which are plagued by structural forms of marginalization. But I personally feel that that the whole it's the philosophical dimension that we have to continually refer to, and we have to understand, and we have to refer to various philosophical traditions, amalgamate them, juxtapose them, and create a continuum from disadvantage to advantage. And it has to be inclusive. It cannot be based, like you said, it has to be plural. The elbow has to bend. It has to take in consideration the concerns of all communities and all people, and try to treat them equally. So, in my opinion, the notions of treatment, fairness, and of equality become core and central. So I continue to believe that the predicate of equality is itself unequal, because it is formal and legal. It does not take into account the kind of structural discriminations and deprivation that we bring. And the state, by simply treating everybody as formal, legally equal, legal and legal in legal terms and informal terms, uh, does great injustice to the structural inequality that we bring to the table. So notion of equality in itself has to be rethought of in a more substantive manner, and how we can make it more, beyond that formality of the legal manner in which it is implemented. So that requires taking into account the disadvantages that each community has had over historical disadvantages, economic disadvantages, social disadvantages. And it's a larger project, and it requires a lot of thought, a lot of inputs from various policymakers, scholars, academicians, and this is what this forum is all about. And today you contextualized it in terms of various theoretical traditions, and also, this whole notion of morality. So, when we place it in the context of, your student had placed it, whose morality and whose sacredness, and is it acceptable to everybody? So, or should it be acceptable to it? Why should it be acceptable to everybody? So, we should have a more inclusive tradition of sacredness, which is again, it's not, it has to be substantive. So that's all some of my thoughts on this lecture today. And thank you so much, Dr. Sampath, for taking time out from your busy schedule. I know you're busy and you have a lot of work to do today, and meeting after meeting. So thank you so much for taking out time today, and coming here and talking to us, and also answering each and every one of our questions. We're really grateful, and I'm really inspired your vision for an equal society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prashant. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. So we'll wish you well, and we'll meet again. Bye. All right, Rupji, thank you so much.